Our special guest this week is Thomas Frederiksen. Thomas is a Danish citizen living in Seoul. He was born in Copenhagen, but grew up in various places, such as the United States and France, and attended international schools in those countries. He first came to Korea in 2007 as an exchange student at Ewha Women's University, enjoyed his stay here, and finally moved in 2009. Thomas is the co-author of Thomas and Anders' South American Travel Diary and English Paparazzi. Welcome to the studio, Thomas. We're happy to see you here tonight.
Thank you very much. I'm really glad to get the chance to talk about books. It's not often that happens.
Well, that's all we do here at the Bookend, so you're in the right place.
Good.
Well, I want to start off actually with a question that's a little bit different than the book title. Mm-hmm. It's Koreans love English, right? So what is your approach to constructing these books? Your goal is, and your motivation was really to create something that was a learning tool, correct?
Yeah, of course. Learning is the main focus of why people buy the books, but as you know and everyone knows, there's so many English books on the market these days.
Right.
So I think just education is not enough anymore. You have to provide education plus something else. So we're focusing more on the something else.
Right. And so the something else is definitely different, right? It's diaries and banners and some of these other types of interactive ways.
Right. Well, the whole point is, I learned English. I went to international school, but I kind of just learned as a child growing up, watching Sesame Street,
mm-hmm.
Listening to music.
Sure.
And I think that's the best way, is to do something that you enjoy doing and get the English through that. So I want to focus on activities that people can enjoy.
Yeah, and that's definitely true. Is anything that can generate that intrinsic motivation in someone to access information on whatever subject they are interested in. So
yeah, of course. And it's different for every person, whatever their interest is, something will appeal to them. So we're trying to find different avenues that will appeal to different kind of people.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So what made you decide to approach this from a book perspective?
Oh, it's because when I first got hired here, it was for a publishing company.
Okay.
And my first job was proofreading and editing other people's English manuscripts.
Uh-huh.
And to be honest, most of the time they were pretty horrible.
That's definitely true. Well, part of it is I'm sure as you've been here a long time and you're aware that there are so many bilingual English users, mm-hmm. and there's so much material that is produced. It's almost impossible to have everything double checked by a native speaker or basically native speaker, correct?
Right, that's true. But I still think it's not so much the quality of what they're doing, but the ideas behind it I felt was lacking.
Okay.
That it was very safe and predictable and just not very inspiring. And I thought if I was a person buying this book, I wouldn't want to study in this way.
Yeah.
So I can't imagine other people would do it, and that was really the motivation for why we started making our own book series.
Yeah, well, that's a great idea, and actually, I'm going to invite you to share the story. I did a little background research on you, Thomas, and you've got a great story of how you wound up at this publishing company. Could you share it with us?
Oh, really? You want to hear that story?
Just if you could.
Okay. It was when I was here as an exchange student in 2007. And I went to Bukhansan Mountain, and I was sitting on the bus reading a Goethe biography.
Uh-huh.
And an elderly gentleman approached me, Korean man, and asked what I was reading. And I told him about this Goethe book that I was reading. And it turns out he was a publishing company owner. And he was there with a whole hiking group full of publishers. So they invited me to hike with them, and that was pretty much how I made that contact.
A serendipity. That's a very awesome story.
It shows that books can really lead somewhere. If I hadn't been reading, he probably wouldn't have approached me. So
that's true. If you'd been just scrolling on a smartphone or something.
Right.
So, you mentioned that your approach to publishing these specific books had to do with some of your reaction to the books that were on the market. What do you see as some of the shortcomings, without naming names necessarily?
Of course.
What are some examples that you think could bear improvement?
Well, apart from the technical things like grammar mistakes and spelling mistakes, it's mostly the thing that bothers me is that I recognize a kind of Korean English that I think is unnatural, and it's not being presented to people as Korean English. It's being presented as just English.
Right.
So one of the examples that I come across all the time is the kind of sentence like, how nice he is.
Yeah.
How beautiful she is. Mm-hmm. And I don't know about you, but I've never said that sentence in my entire life.
Only poetically.
Right. Well, maybe ironically,
Yeah.
And yet it's being taught in almost every single book. So I'm wondering, why is it so pervasive if you or I would never use it? And it must be some kind of tradition that's getting passed on or some misconception.
Well, part of it is there's a curriculum of all these grammar rules that we have in English. And, it's kind of the Frankenstein of languages, so it's very confusing to begin with. But often when you're trying to teach a rule, you're trying to force a square peg in a round hole to find an example of the rule in use.
Right.
And so you get these really awkward expressions that are accurate examples of a grammar rule, but like you said, there's something that people would never actually say.
Right. Well, I think also from what I can tell, a lot of the books are taught according to a theory, or it's people who went to like a language education course in university, but they themselves are not used to speaking that much.
Yeah.
So instead of focusing on theory, we focus on more realistic uses of English, I would say.
Yeah.
Because that's how I learned it, as I said before.
Right.
So I think that's a big difference, the theory versus real use of English.
Well, could you give us some concrete examples of what you present in your book and some, like how your theories perhaps are more interesting for young people?
Well, a lot of like contractions like wanna, gonna, those kind of things that, or like the example I used before, you can still say, oh, how nice, or oh, how kind of him to think of us. But it has to be natural within the context of the conversation. So I think like providing the context for what people are doing and what they're saying is as important as just saying, here's a sentence. Use it.
Right. Yeah, I definitely noticed that when I was first coming to Korea and was looking at phrase books, I kept on wondering, like, how am I going to remember this phrase when this situation occurs? And, some of the phrase books were odd when you need a watch repaired,
One of the ones that I always remember is that a wolf or a fox? And it's another sentence that I haven't used that much in my life, I must admit.
What does the fox say? Well, Thomas, I was wondering if you could share a little bit about the new book that you have published, the Thomas and Anders' South American Travel Diary.
All right. First, I got to correct you a little bit. It's Anders.
Anders.
Yeah.
Okay.
He'll kill me if I don't put that out there.
Fair correction. So.
Right. It's a Scandinavian name, so that's why.
Yeah, makes sense.
So Anders is my brother, and together we took a 3-month backpacking trip to South America last year. And we visited 5 different countries, and we wrote a book about that experience basically in the form of a diary. So the point of that book is you read the diary and kind of follow our trip, and at the same time get tips for writing your own diary based on that.
So is it kind of a fill-in-the-blank type book, or what's the format?
No, not at all. Well, we call it an inspiration diary, which is a term that I like a lot.
Yeah.
So it's not, some of it is like specific sentence structures or vocabulary connected with traveling, but it's more about capturing the mood of, I'm in this place, I have this emotion, how do I express it?
Okay.
So it's, we've presented our way of doing it based on our trip. And then people can say, oh, well, maybe I'll write the same as them, or, oh, I might phrase it a little bit differently. So it's more about giving people the freedom to express themselves when they're traveling.
Okay. And, that's something that's really important for certainly a lot of Koreans is this big barrier that can kind of come into their lives when they have the idea of traveling by themselves and not in a group and having to encounter these real-world English experiences. So is this something that you think that they could carry with them on a trip to kind of help them in these situations, or do you see it? Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
It's meant for that. So not only, I think also part of what I meant by inspiration is the way that we travel is quite unusual. It's not a luxury vacation or tour group where everything is planned. It's very random and chaotic and oftentimes confusing or scary.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of mirrors that emotion that you're talking about of being in a new country and kind of wondering what's going on.
Yeah.
So I think we not only explain about the English and the writing part, but that aspect of it as well, of getting to a new place, discovering things, and learning through those experiences, I think is included in the book as well.
So when you say adventure, I'm assuming that this is perhaps an edited version of the adventure?
Well, we put most... the level of detail maybe is not as detailed as we could have written, but we put most of the interesting stuff in there, yeah.
Okay, great. Now, is there a wariness that you need to worry about when you're encouraging people to, I assume, couch surf and hostel and do some of these other...
Luckily, Anders and I are not that kind of traveler, so it's not like drunken debauchery kind of stuff.
Okay.
It's PG, yeah.
All right, sounds good. Well, I was wondering, speaking of your brother, tell me, who does what when you're dividing the labor? Is it kind of a mixed bag, or you are obviously the one that's working for the publishing company? Did you bring your brother in just as a gesture, or does he also have these strong motivations to help people?
Oh, we both work together. He also works for the company, but he kind of comes and goes because he's still finishing his education.
Okay.
But he's completely committed to what we're doing. And whenever we write new books, we always discuss everything together. And that's part of the process is working it over with each other, as opposed to if I was doing it with myself, it would just be my thoughts. But together, I think much more creative and beneficial kind of relationship.
Okay, so it sounds like you've been close with him, and this is just a really great experience for the both of you.
Oh, yeah, we're super close, yeah. And when we're working, we normally have all the ideas together, discuss it together, but then write it separately. So in this case, he did the practical part, the diary part, and then I wrote, his part is called Anders's Actions, and my part is Thomas's Themes.
Okay.
So they're more broad themes about South American culture, because we realized a lot of people don't really know about real life in South America. So we needed that kind of part to educate a little bit about food and transportation, those kind of things.
Well, maybe you could fill the listeners in on exactly the course that the trip takes. You know, where in South America are you going? This vast continent, many different cultures. Fill us in.
We started off in Rio de Janeiro.
Okay.
And then we went down to Iguazu Waterfall. And then through to Argentina, Chile, Peru, with a stop in Machu Picchu, Bolivia, and back to Brazil. So we kind of went in a circle. Okay. And kept to the middle of the continent, I guess.
Yeah. I didn't think there was anything rated PG in Rio, actually. Did you guys? That must have been an awesome experience. When were you there?
We started the trip in September and finished in December.
So you saw a lot of the gearing up for the World Cup, I assume?
No, well, as you know, it was way behind schedule. Right. So we didn't see that much. We went to the Maracana Stadium, but there wasn't that much preparation going on. Yeah. Actually, Rio is one of the cities that we describe a lot in the book because we had a very odd relationship to it. Okay. And part of it is what you mentioned about that fantasy of this crazy Rio lifestyle. Right. But when we went there, it was quite different, actually. So that's one thing that we learned a lot was about the city of Rio.
Well, how so? How was it different than what you'd expected?
Well, you know, people always picture sunny all the time. Yeah. Not true. Okay. And they picture kind of lying on the beach, you know, sipping drinks. But when we went there, beaches were completely empty, and just the whole mood was a little bit different. It wasn't that kind of carefree environment. So it was kind of rude awakening as the first place that we went on the trip, and it helped color our experiences for the rest of the trip in terms of what to expect and what the reality is. Okay. I think that's quite important,
yeah. Well, you'd mentioned earlier that you talk about these are inspirational diaries. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you think diaries can help people achieve their goals in writing.
Right. Well, for me, I mentioned before, one of the most important things, I think, with English education is real. It has to be real. And the other thing is emotion. It has to have some emotional importance to the person writing. And diary has exactly those two criteria. And I think that's the point of language, is self-expression, pretty much. And diary is really essence of self-expression. So what I want people to get out of it when they're using this book is having some emotion, having some thought, and then being able to express it in another language to their satisfaction. I think that's really kind of wonderful to be able to do that, you know.
Yeah. Well, I'm just curious, do you expect this book to be something that people pick up and give to their children or buy on their own, perhaps, and practice independently? Or do you see this as getting worked into a curriculum somewhere where you've got somebody instructing them to start filling out these diaries in a manner like you and your brother have done?
That's a good question. Most of the books that we write are primarily for self-study, especially for university students or like a little bit older. I wouldn't say high school, older than high school maybe. Okay. So people traveling by themselves or people who have some aspiration to use English, not for their job, but for their own life.
Okay, so it's definitely more of an adult-themed diary. Maybe the life of a child might be a little bit repetitive for diary works. They're not.
Of course. Well, also, it is meant to be used specifically for traveling, that there are a lot of other diaries about my job, my family, but this one is specifically for people traveling. So normally it's older people in that demographic.
Okay. Well, Thomas, I'm going to change tracks a little bit because this is the second book that you published, and the first one was called English. This is the third book. Okay. Right. I'd only realized that you also had English Paparazzi. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about English Paparazzi with us.
Yeah, that was another one of our kind of, what I would call our fusion books of English and something else. And the concept for that book is, we live in Seoul and we saw these wrong instances of English being used all over the city. So we thought, why not base our material on those mistakes? Mm-hmm. So instead of coming up with these kind of phony examples like we talked about before, we went around and took photos of all the English mistakes we could find, put them in the book, and then taught our lessons based on that. So that's where that paparazzi aspect comes in. Yeah,
I really like that connection with the photojournalism and the paparazzi. And I was wondering if you could clarify, just for the listeners, were you looking for translation errors? Because we see a lot of those things come up on the internet. Or are these specifically common usage mistakes that you were focusing on?
I guess it's both of them, but mostly the common usage ones. Okay. Like, to give you one example is one that I see being used repetitively, and always the same kind of mistake is the world best convenience store, for example, or just world best, but world's best with the apostrophe S.
Sure.
And the article D in front of it. And it's strange because that seems to be the accepted way of writing it here, world's best or world best something all the time. Mm-hmm. And I even asked one of my friends and she said, oh, well, I know that it's incorrect, but isn't it okay as an advertising slogan? Mm-hmm. And I said, no, of course not. It's a mistake no matter what. And I think it's just so deeply ingrained that people are used to that mistake.
Well, sometimes I wonder if because there's a little bit of a crossover where it becomes okay. We often do that type of work, not without the apostrophe S, of course, but dropping the articles when people are reading newspaper headlines and news headlines. And I think that maybe, if you're getting these bold print, these advertising slogans, perhaps they're getting confused on that level. But
we covered that topic in the book about do not touch, or another one that actually a lot of people came up and asked me if the sentence is wrong is baby in car. Which is grammatically incorrect, but that's kind of socially acceptable in English because people know what it means. So we covered that type of error, if you can call it that.
Well, do you deal a lot in the book with the difference between what you're talking about, perhaps written English, which tends to have a priority on accuracy, versus spoken English, which is often very informal, and in fact, if you speak with somebody who only uses perfect English, it's kind of annoying. So,
right. Well, in this book, the paparazzi one specifically, it was all based on print because it was photos. But I'll still say that most of the mistakes were so egregious that even it wasn't like nitpicking. It was big mistakes,
So how long did it take you to compile all the images in the book?
That one, it took about 1 year to get the photos and then 1 year to write it. So 2 years all in all.
And you worked with your brother as well?
Yep, on that one.
Okay. And you did most of the photo work. Is he also living in Seoul?
He kind of comes and goes. At that time, he was here with me, and we took all the photos together and wrote everything together.
Okay. And when this book was put forward, did you present it as a learning material? Because the last, the diary book, we're thinking of how can students learn from this. Was this presented as can you correct the errors type of thing, or what was the point of it?
Well, we have an English book series called the English Paparazzi series, and it's all English books within that series. So aside from the two books we've mentioned, there's also a travel English book and a easy vocabulary book. So it is all based on English education,
Yeah. I have a different type of question for you. When you're talking about some of the written Konglish, and that's the phrase that was used, I think, in prior circumstances describing the book. Now, do you see the spoken aspect of using English words in different ways within a society as something similar to maybe the way that English has adopted words from Spanish and French and German? Or do you see it as somehow different?
Right. I know exactly what you're talking about. That's actually... Anderson and I, when we talk about the book, we don't really use that term Konglish.
Right.
Because that's what you're talking about is a kind of assimilation of English into Korean.
Right.
So to me, Konglish is a part of the Korean language.
Yeah, that's what I've always thought.
What we focus on is Korean English.
Okay.
How English is used in Korea.
Okay.
And I think that's more interesting in some ways.
Yeah, and it definitely is worth examining and perhaps correcting. Where I have got mixed feelings about whether or not Konglish is something, or what we talk about as Konglish, as people who live here, is something that necessarily needs to be corrected or changed.
I find that quite charming. I think it's like a kind of unique, thing that only exists in Korea.
I don't use cell phone anymore. I use hand phone. So,
But I still would say as a kind of slight warning, though, that if people can't distinguish when they're using one and the other, that's when it gets kind of tricky. So if you know that this is a specific Konglish expression, it's fine. But if you approach someone in a business situation, for example, and start using those terms, that's a problem.
It could be a bit confusing. Well, you've said that your goal is to be an alternative textbook provider. Do you have any other projects that you have lined up for this?
The next one that we're working on is one that will be called Super Simple Grammar. And, there's already been so many different grammar books. It's been done in so many ways. So we're trying to find a new and interesting way to teach it using pictures and kind of role play, different kind of things like that.
That sounds like a great new avenue for people to pursue when they're trying to learn English. It's a very difficult subject, and especially in an EFL instead of ESL type of context. It sounds like you're doing great work. Do you have a song that you would like us to play?
I do, yes. I'd love to hear Billy Ocean's Get Out of My Dreams and Into My Car.
That's going to make me laugh every time. Thomas, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us here at The Bookend.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It was a good time.
That's all we have for tonight, but tune in tomorrow at 6 for Sunday's edition of The Bookend. We'll leave you tonight with Thomas's request, Get Out of My Dreams, Get Into My Car by Billy Ocean.